December 24, 1944, 12,000 feet over the Ardennes forest. Oberleutnant Werner Möbius watched his wingman disappear. Not shot down, not spiraling in flames. Disappeared. One instant, Feldwebelkraft's Focke-Wulf 190 was holding formation off his starboard wing. The next, a black flash bloomed 20 meters short of the cockpit. No aircraft behind them, no tracer stream from below, no visible flak burst climbing to meet them. And where craft had been, there was only a shower of aluminum falling into the snow. Möbius climbed. He banked. He searched the sky for the American fighter that must have fired. There was none. He returned to Rainer Airfield with a report his squadron commander refused to accept. American shells were exploding in mid-air near his aircraft without touching them. His mechanic, checking the fuselage, found 17 fragmentation punctures on the port side. Nothing had hit him. Nothing should have hit him. What Möbius did not know, what no German pilot, engineer, or intelligence officer would fully understand until 1946, was that the United States had been hiding this weapon for exactly 2 years and had just released it into the sky over his head. The Americans called it the VT Fuze, 2 letters chosen for their meaninglessness. Officially, they stood for variable time, a name deliberately manufactured to suggest an ordinary timer mechanism, the kind of fuse artillerymen had used since the Great War. The truth was something else entirely. Inside every VT fuzzed shell was a miniature radio station, a transmitter, a receiver, 4 vacuum tubes the size of a rifle cartridge, a battery activated by centrifugal force, and an amplifier that measured the Doppler shift of radio waves bouncing off whatever object the shell was flying toward. When the returning signal indicated the target was within lethal range, roughly 70 feet, the fuse fired. The shell exploded in mid-air. No contact required. No timing required. Just proximity. The physics were straightforward. The engineering was not. Every previous vacuum tube in existence would shatter under the forces of being shot from a naval gun. A 5-inch shell experiences 20,000 times the force of gravity at the moment of firing, spinning at 400 rotations per second. Nothing electronic could survive that environment. Nothing was supposed to, which was precisely why, when the first American proximity shells exploded in the sky above the Japanese fleet in January 1943, no Axis engineer believed what he was seeing. The weapon had been developed in absolute secrecy at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, then moved to the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins. The physicist in charge was Merle Tuve, a soft-spoken South Dakotan who had spent the 1930s bouncing radio waves off the ionosphere. His team called themselves Section T. By 1943, they had assembled a workforce of over 80,000 people across a dozen manufacturers: Crosley, Sylvania, RCA, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, most of whom had no idea what they were building. Kodak workers thought they were producing camera parts. Every fuse cost $732 to manufacture in 1942. By 1945, the price would collapse to 18. In total, 22 million would be produced, and for 2 full years, the United States government refused to let a single one be fired over land. The order came from the top, from the Joint Chiefs, from Admiral Ernest King himself. VT-fused shells could be fired only over water, only from ships, only in circumstances where an unexploded dud would sink into the ocean and be lost forever. The reasoning was ruthless in its logic. The proximity fuse was the second most classified weapons program in America, outranked only by the Manhattan Project. A single intact specimen recovered from a battlefield, taken to a Berlin laboratory, disassembled and copied, would be catastrophic. The Germans would gain the same capability. And the Germans, by mid-1944, would begin firing V-1 flying bombs at London. If the Luftwaffe fitted proximity fuses to their anti-aircraft shells, Allied bomber losses over Europe would triple overnight. If the Kriegsmarine equipped its guns with them, no Allied ship in the North Atlantic would survive. The mathematics of the air war would invert, so the rule was absolute. Over water only, under no circumstances land, not to break a siege, not to save a bombardment, not to shorten the war. Ground commanders in Italy and the Pacific begged for exceptions and were denied. General George Patton, informed in a private briefing about the existence of a shell that could annihilate an entire German infantry battalion in the open, was told in the same breath that he could not have it. The scientists at Section T began calling it the Golden BB, a weapon so decisive, so game-changing, that using it wrong meant losing the war they were trying to win. Aboard American destroyers and light cruisers in the Pacific, gun crews loaded the shells, knowing only that they were called special. The word proximity was forbidden. The word radio was forbidden. Sailors who serviced the ammunition magazines were briefed that these were experimental time fuses, nothing more. Even the officers who fired them did not, in most cases, know what was inside. They only knew that the shells worked. They knew that Japanese aircraft, once tracked by American gunners, seemed to explode of their own accord in the air. January 5, 1943. Waters off Guadalcanal. The light cruiser USS Helena, escorting a convoy through the Solomons, spotted a formation of Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bombers, the aircraft the Americans called VALs, descending toward her from the north. Helena's gunnery officer gave the order. The 5-inch batteries opened fire. The first VAL was several hundred yards from the ship when it disintegrated in mid-flight. The explosion appeared to happen in empty sky, roughly 70 feet in front of the aircraft. The plane simply flew into its own destruction. It was the first confirmed combat kill of the proximity fuse. The gun crews who witnessed it had no idea they had just changed the physics of anti-aircraft warfare. To them, it looked like an extraordinary piece of luck. Over the following months, the pattern repeated. Japanese pilots began reporting that American ships had achieved impossibly accurate anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft that had, statistically, been safe at 3/4 of a mile from a warship were now dying at that range. The Imperial Japanese Navy convened technical panels to explain the losses. Their conclusions ranged from radar-directed timing improvements to sabotage of onboard instruments. None of them guessed the truth. By late 1944, U.S. Navy statistics showed a doubling of anti-aircraft effectiveness across ships equipped with the new fuse. In the great carrier engagements of the Philippine Sea and the defense of the Marianas, the ratio was closer to fourfold. Japanese aviators, in their after-action reports, began describing what one translation renders as the wall of exploding air. They believed the Americans had invented some form of directed energy weapon. They believed the sky itself had become hostile. And still, the Americans held the fuse back from land warfare. Still, no shell was allowed to travel any trajectory that ended on soil the Germans might reach. Section T's engineers, watching Japanese aircraft fall by the hundreds, wondered how long the discipline could last. Discipline, in war, is imperfect. Between 1943 and 1944, at least 4 VT-fuzzed shells fell into German or German-adjacent hands. The first was recovered from a Kriegsmarine vessel struck in the North Sea. The shell had failed to detonate, a manufacturing defect, one in perhaps 10,000, and was found lodged in the ship's superstructure. It was crated, labelled, and dispatched to the Reichsluftfahrtministerium's Technical Intelligence Branch in Berlin. The second came from an Allied bomber lost over occupied Europe, carrying anti-aircraft ammunition that had been improperly loaded from Navy stores intended for shipboard use. The third and fourth arrived through channels the Germans never publicly documented, believed by post-war researchers to be misrouted shipments or shells recovered from grounded transport aircraft. By the summer of 1944, German engineers at Rechlin and at the Peenemünde weapons facility had 4 intact American proximity fuses on their workbenches. They had disassembled them, they had photographed every component, they had X-rayed the vacuum tubes, they still could not reproduce it. The problem was not conceptual. German physicists understood the principle within days, a self-contained radio echo detector. The problem was manufacturing. The tubes inside the American fuse were subminiature triodes and pentodes, engineered specifically to survive the shock of firing. The filaments were suspended in configurations that no European electronics industry had ever mass-produced. The batteries used a glass ampule of electrolyte that shattered on setback and flooded the plates only after the shell was airborne, an activation sequence so elegant that German engineers initially believed it was a decoy. Reproducing a single fuse in a laboratory would have taken the Germans, by their own admission in post-war interrogations, perhaps 8 to 12 months. Reproducing them at a rate of thousands per day, as the Americans were doing, would have required an industrial infrastructure they no longer possessed. By late 1944, Allied bombing had gutted Germany's precision electronics capacity. The Volksempfänger radio, the pride of Nazi consumer engineering, contained tubes many times larger than what Section T had shrunk into a rifle cartridge. They held the answer in their hands, and they could not use it. Then came the V1. On June 13, 1944, 1 week after the Normandy landings, the first Fieseler F-103 flying bomb crossed the English Channel and detonated in London's East End, killing 6 people. Over the following months, Germany launched over 9,000 of them at England. The V1 flew at 400 miles per hour, cruised near 3,000 feet, and possessed no evasive capability. It was, in theory, a perfect target for anti-aircraft artillery. In practice, it was too fast for hand-fused shells and too small for radar-directed timing to reliably kill. The British asked. President Roosevelt authorized. For the first time since the fuse had entered service, the U.S. War Department released VT-fused 90mm shells to a land-based defense, the anti-aircraft belt along the southern English coast. The condition was that batteries could only fire on tracks that carried the shells over the channel, so that duds would fall into the sea. The results transformed the war. In June 1944, English anti-aircraft batteries destroyed roughly 17% of incoming V1s. By August, with the new fuse in general issue, the figure had climbed above 60%. In one representative 7-day stretch that same month, gunners downed 79% of every V1 sent against them. The Luftwaffe intelligence services could not explain the collapse. They shifted launch sites, altered flight altitudes, varied approach vectors. Nothing helped. The British were killing their weapons in the air. German technical assessments concluded, incorrectly, that the British had built a new radar-linked centralized gun-laying computer. Reports were dispatched to Berlin, recommending a redesign of the V1 to fly higher, faster, at night. But by then the launch sites in France had been overrun by Allied ground forces, and the V1 campaign against London was collapsing from the other end. The proximity fuse had, in effect, ended a strategic bombardment campaign. And still, over the European battlefield itself, it remained forbidden, until the 16th of December. At 5:30 that morning, in dense fog along an 80-mile front from Monschau to Echternach, more than 20 German divisions attacked the thinly held American positions of the Ardennes forest. It was the beginning of what the Wehrmacht called Wacht am Rhein, and what the Americans would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Panzer columns, infantry echelons, Waffen-SS assault battalions, nearly 400,000 men, driving west toward Antwerp in a last catastrophic gamble. Within days of the assault beginning, orders arrived at U.S. Army artillery batteries across the Ardennes. Load special ammunition, fire at will, over friendly and enemy territory alike. The land restriction was over. The most decisive engagement came at Elsenborn Ridge, on the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough, where the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions held a shallow line of foxholes against the entire strength of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army. On the night of December 17th, the American batteries opened fire with VT-fused 105mm shells. The results were unlike any artillery bombardment of the war. German infantry advancing through the open forest were killed by shells that exploded 20 meters above them, treetop bursts that hurled fragmentation downward through helmets and greatcoats. A slit trench, previously the standard survival technique against artillery, offered no protection. The fragments came from above. Shell after shell detonated in the air over the German columns without ever striking the ground. Wehrmacht officers in radio communications intercepted by American signals intelligence described the fire as annihilation from an invisible source. Elsenborn Ridge held. The northern shoulder of the German offensive collapsed within a week. 5th Panzer Army in the centre made deeper progress, but was stopped at Bastogne and along the Meuse. Post-war casualty analysis suggested that the VT Fuze, in its first month of European land use, killed or wounded roughly 7 times as many enemy soldiers per shell fired as a conventional timed fuse. General George Patton, whose Third Army pivoted north to relieve Bastogne, wrote in a personal letter to General Levin Campbell of Army Ordnance that the funny fuse VT was devastating and would win the war. He did not, even in a private letter, explain how it worked. Above the ground columns, the Luftwaffe was suffering the same devastation. On December 24th, the day Oberleutnant Möbius watched his wingmen disappear, German fighter pilots discovered that American 90mm anti-aircraft batteries, now equipped with VT-fused shells, could reach out and kill them at altitudes and ranges they had previously considered safe. In the 2 weeks between December 16th and December 31st, 1944, Luftwaffe combat losses over the Ardennes exceeded those of any comparable period since the summer of 1943. Pilots landed with reports that echoed Möbius's shells exploding without visible incoming fire, aircraft disintegrating without warning, fragmentation damage from bursts that could not be reconstructed. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium ordered a technical investigation. It concluded that the Americans had improved their radar-directed anti-aircraft computers. The investigators had 4 VT fuses in their laboratory. They still did not connect the 2 facts. Möbius himself was shot down on a later sortie, bailed out, and spent the following 18 months as a prisoner in an American camp near Metz. When he was released in 1946, the U.S. War Department had just declassified the proximity fuse program. He read the technical bulletins in his kitchen in Bremen, and according to those who later spoke with him, sat with the pamphlet for hours before writing a single sentence in his notebook. "We were fighting a country that had put a radio inside a shell, and none of us knew. 22 million of those shells were produced by the end of the war." The Manhattan Project cost the United States roughly $2 billion. The Proximity Fuse program cost roughly $1 billion. Its impact on the outcome of the war, measured in aircraft destroyed, artillery casualties inflicted, buzz bombs neutralized, and German offensives broken, is judged by many historians to have been comparable. America withheld its deadliest shell for 2 years because it feared what Germany might do with it. When it finally fired, Germany had no answer. The wall of exploding air had reached Europe.